Okay, you're live. Great. I see a lot of people coming in and joining us today. So we'll allow people to go ahead and make sure that they're logging into the room before we start right around 1 o'clock. All right. If you have just joined in the room, we are just waiting until right at 1 before we jump in. We want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to join and as we get started. See a lot of folks still joining the room. Thank you so much for joining us today. As we jump into things, I actually would love to invite you all. There is a chat feature that is a part of Zoom. Hopefully you see at the bottom of your screen, and we would just love to kind of hear the different organizations and states that people are joining us from today. So if you're interested and want to add that into the chat box there, we would love to just be able to see the different representation that we have on the webinar today. So thank you so much for joining. I will go ahead. Awesome, thank you so much for adding that in, Susan. I will go ahead and we'll jump into the presentation so that we can make sure that we are really just making the most of our time here today. So give me just a second. So you should be seeing my presentation on the screen. Give me just 1 minute. Okay. As it is loading, I just want to make sure we review a few things. Just a few notes. I was going to say, first of all, thank you for joining us today on this webinar about stimulus funding hosted by Duke Solutions. And we have some incredible industry experts joining us today. I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment. As we jump into this presentation, I just wanted to let everyone know that your microphones and your phone lines have been muted. So if you have any comments, feel free to add those into the chat box. Additionally, we do have a Q&A functionality at the bottom of Zoom, and so we would love for you to submit your questions and anything that you would like for the panelists to address towards the end of this webinar. If you want to submit those throughout the webinar, we'll make sure that we get to those at the end, where we have reserved about 10 minutes to be able to cover the different questions that folks submit. If we do not get to your question, we will definitely be following up with you. And then finally, I did just want to let everyone know that we are recording the session, so you should receive that recording afterwards. So with that, I will hand it over to our moderator from Duke Solutions, Steve Roth, and I will go ahead and continue to try to make sure that we have our presentation up and running. So I'll pass it to you, Steve.
Great. Well, welcome everybody to this webinar on stimulus funding, what you need to know, and how to prepare for what's next. This is a hot topic in light of the fascinating year that we've been having worldwide. I'd like to, we're very fortunate today to have two really outstanding panelists one who I've known for a while and one who I've just gotten to know over the course of the last month. So I'm going to start with Mary Filardo, who comes to us from the 21st Century School Fund. Mary, can you tell us a little bit about yourself for the audience, please?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So I have made my life's work trying to understand how to make public school buildings better for kids and for teachers. And so I've done that from the civic sector, working on policy and doing research and advocacy at the local level in the District of Columbia, where my kids were in very dilapidated public schools decades ago. And now my grandchildren are actually in very nice schools, thanks to some of the work that we were able to do here. And then also working at the state level, and now currently been very active advocating at federal policy level in order to address the enormous inequities that we see from district to district. So I also have the honor of working with the state facility directors as coordinator for the National Council on School Facilities and lead a coalition called Build America's School Infrastructure, which has been working on the federal policy. So I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk with folks, and I'm always interested in hearing any questions or comments from people, because the more I know, the better I can give voice to it to others. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. And we also have the pleasure of another panelist, Seth Robertson, who I just got to meet about a month ago, who is in Cary, North Carolina, which is also where Dude Solutions is headquartered. Seth is Vice President and Department Head of Funding and Asset Management for Withers Ravenel. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Seth?
Sure. So my background is I'm an engineer by training and education, working with local governments for the last 20 plus years, primarily on water, wastewater, stormwater, infrastructure type issues. Most recently, before joining Withers Ravenel, I spent a little over 13 years with the Division of Water Infrastructure here in North Carolina. It's part of the Department of Environmental Quality. I ran the state revolving fund and other critical water and sewer infrastructure funding programs for the state, so state and federal funds that we have here in North Carolina. Also served as co-chair for the National State EPA SRF work group. Set up the asset management programs in North Carolina, funding programs, merger programs, a lot of involvement in finance and viability of utilities, seeing the issues that are going on out there in our local governments. And honestly, those issues with utilities are really stressing a lot of overall community finances as well. Had the opportunity to come to Withers Ravenel a little over a year ago now, where I get to work with all sizes of municipalities, dealing with everything from their general financial issues, their water and sewer, stormwater, utilities, infrastructure issues, and really helping promote asset management as a more proactive way of managing utilities in a really challenging environment from a financial standpoint, matched with a very challenging environment with the state of infrastructure that we have.
Fantastic. Well, we appreciate you both being here. We've got a lot of, we're going to have a lot of questions and a lot of content, and I'm hoping we get through most of it. We're certainly got a topic that I think is in the forefront of most people's minds. So we're going to break this down into sort of three sections. The first one we're going to focus on is really what is the current reality? Where are we today with COVID-19? How has it changed the world that we're in? Prior to this, you were being asked to do a whole lot more with a whole lot less. You were asked to be, to get smart about budgets and resources. And the realities today is really only magnified with the global pandemic, and probably something we're dealing with today and we'll be dealing with for many years to come. So that's the first part. Second part is when we want to talk through what are some of the funding sources that are available to both local government and schools today. We've got several sources, one of them being the CARES Act, which we'll talk through a little bit about, and also hit on the elementary and secondary emerging emergency relief fund as it relates to the CARES Act. So we'll cover that as part 2 of this. And then finally, we'll wrap up with, what are the steps that you can take now to set yourself up for success in this dynamic environment. So those are the 3 sections, and we're going to save about, I think we've got around 10 minutes left towards the end of this webinar for questions for both panelists. So I am going to start out with a couple of questions related to our current reality. First one here goes to Mary. Mary, what is the current state of the public sector in the midst of COVID-19, and specifically schools and government? As we know, were not in great shape prior to this. There's a massive infrastructure deficit, which I've worked with you and other members of the 21st Century Fund. We've been up to Capitol Hill to talk about this, but what is it? What are you seeing today as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic as it relates to public education?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Well, for anybody that's in schools nationally, they know it's really a challenge. So part of what's happened is that the standards, because of the risks associated with health and safety being in a pandemic, the standards for what both staff and students really need to see in a place, in the school buildings and grounds, the standards have gotten higher. So they're higher in terms of air quality, they're higher in terms of cleanliness, they're higher in terms of sort of the amount of space that needs to be available to deliver instruction or any other function. So, picture 500 kids walking into a school. You can't just crowd in the one door, which, we've done a lot of work in schools to try to centralize security for security purposes. Well, now people have to think that. So part of what's going on is that we have new standards on top of already some very important standards. And it has shown a spotlight on the problems that we have already pre-COVID. So a GAO report just came out on June 4th. Folks might want to take a look at it. It's not very long. And what it indicates is that almost half of our schools have half or more of their mechanical systems in need of upgrade or replacement. Well, put that together with the statements that public health people are making, that you want to make sure you have, a lot of fresh air, good air quality. So, Seth, you might have something to add to that, but you can just see right there, you have a real problem.
So, Seth, how do you think about that? Giving, we're going to see a decline in tax revenues and some of the economic realities as a result of this. What do you think we can expect in the next 6, 9, 12 months?
So, first thing I'll say is it's going to vary, I think, a lot from one community to the next as far as the impact, especially when you look at things at taxes, when you look at impacts on collections for water and sewer and rates and those type of issues. We're seeing it pretty widely in North Carolina. Some areas are going to open faster than other areas. Some areas are just not going to have the same level of immediacy. Some of the urban areas obviously have a lot more impacts around here than some of the rural areas. So it's going to be hard to tell. And the biggest issue right now that most of the local governments are seeing is they're still really early in getting data back about what the impacts have been. There's a lag in tax information and some of that. So what I've seen most utilities, most towns planning for going into the next fiscal year, starting in a couple weeks basically, is planning on somewhere in a neighborhood of 20-25% reduction in tax revenue when you're looking at sales tax. That's kind of what they're planning for right now. And then, like I said, you're seeing similar issues from being able to collect things like utilities, at least in North Carolina, as other places as well. We have an executive order here that don't allow utilities to cut off water or sewer, not letting you do some of those collections things right now, which I don't disagree with, but it's certainly causing a short-term, at least, cash crunch for what were already pretty financially strapped local governments to begin with.
So is this, Seth, in your opinion, is this like anything we've ever seen before? I mean, is there anything that we can look to the past anyway to help us understand a little bit better what we might be expecting in the future?
I think it's unique from a financial standpoint in that the effects were so strong and so immediate as far as what we're seeing right this moment. To see, for instance, tax revenues just, almost evaporate overnight where everything just shut down. No, I've never seen anything like it. As far as maybe what the long-term impacts as things kind of slowly come back, and I think the expectation from most people is it's going to be a relatively slow recovery. Hopefully a nice tick up when there is some reopening, but still pretty slow, maybe a year or more before we can kind of get back to something more normal, is maybe looking back towards 2009, coming out of the last recession, and some of the things that were in place and were happening then. And realistically, a lot of the communities that are hitting the COVID impacts really were still trying to recover from that recession. There was a great hesitancy coming out of that to do things like increase tax rates to pay for things, to increase rates and fees to pay for things. That had really lagged a lot of the general economy. And what we had already seen were people that were stressed as their expenditures had continued to go up substantially over the last 10 years. When you look at things like not just salaries, but the issues that local governments have dealing with healthcare increases in costs, the liabilities they have for retirement systems, all of those things had been increasing over time to the point where they were already stressed and bringing enough revenue in because there had been this lag in raising things. And now this hits, and it's a really difficult thing to come back from quickly.
Got it. And hey, Mary, one question I wanted to ask you is that do you think that this is something that's, the impact of this is uniform, or are we going to see areas of the country or certain districts that are going to struggle a little bit harder or more than others?
Well, we're definitely going to see districts struggling harder and less hard, but it is it's a pretty shared challenge. I mean, by the end of this last year, almost all of the schools were closed, and it was in all kinds of communities. So it didn't target its impact in that way in terms of the ability to reopen, whether it's transporting kids on buses. Some of the districts where there's the longer transport times, they're really struggling with the idea of how do I get these kids on a bus in a socially distanced way. There are other communities where there's more ability for parents to drive, kind of these multiple trip things where they can drop their kids off at school. They might not need to use the buses. Other communities where you've got greater walkability. So there will be variability, but I think that it's still very much, and we should look at it as a shared. This is really a shared burden and challenge that all of our districts are going to be seeing.
Yep. Do you think that this is going to change the way education is going to be delivered in the future?
It is going to change us. I mean, I have to say that part of what we know is that the social experience, both for learning and for child development, are so important. And I would argue not even just learning and child development, but even for creating civil society. In the end, having to navigate the playground or the classroom is partly where you learn about civil society. And so I think that we will take away things and hopefully some creativity on how to take advantage of some of the technology in educational delivery. But I think that we have to be really careful that we don't lose the in-person and the community experiences that we have in our public schools and in all schools, and think that really the way out of the financial crisis is just to sit kids in front of a screen, because I think that would be an enormous decline in quality for this country.
What about you, Seth? Do you think this is going to impact the way that government services are delivered in the future?
I'm an optimistic person, so I'm hoping that there are good things ultimately that come out of this. I hope there's a realization of some of the fragile aspects of the system that have been stressed as a result of this. And, you know, I hope we come out of this understanding that we have to keep ourselves in good, healthy financial shape to be able to handle kind of the unknowns when they occur. So when we have systems and utilities and towns that are so fragile in their finances, it's really complicated. I also hope it helps people work together, you know, leverage resources between local governments and really try to come up with something that's more resilient at the end of the day and long lasting.
Yep. Fantastic. Well, the next part of this I'd like to talk about is, you know, what are the pending sources of funding? One of the things that's happening as we speak right now, at least in the education sector, is that folks are trying to make budget decisions for next year, and it's extremely difficult given the current situation. They have very little information to go on. More and more is becoming available. But I wanted to start with you, Mary, and talk about you know, there's been several bills that you've been involved with before Congress for infrastructure funding for schools. We now have the CARES Act, where you know, $30.75 billion of funding is made. It's going to be making its way to both public K through 12, as well as some higher education. We have the elementary and secondary emerging relief fund that's available now with $13.2 billion. We've got 50 states with 50 ways that this is being, the information is being distributed. So there's a lot there. And then there's also this next round of funding, you know, round 4 of the stimulus package, which is being discussed as it relates to infrastructure. And I know in my conversations with you, so I'd like you to touch on this, that infrastructure has various definitions depending upon who you speak to. And do you think that, you know, this is going to have an impact for schools as we start to look at that funding in the future? So just get you know, I threw a lot at you there, a lot of information, but I'd like to touch on some of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the, you know, to fully disclose, I mean, CARES, we've watched it, and but I would not put myself out as an expert on CARES exactly. Most of the, like the $13.5 billion to K-12 went by formula to the states, as well as and to the state education agencies, as well as the governors. And that is one area for school districts to make sure that if their governor still has any of that money left, that they not only look at the SEA, but the governor to get some help. I know in talking to one district in Colorado, they had immediately gone to the governor and very quickly gotten $120,000. So that was not a bad, you know, it was a quick turnaround, quick ask. So it's mostly by formula from the state, but then also, as I say, there's the governor's pool. Where I am kind of an expert is on the federal policy to try to get funding for a broad grant program, as well as bond interest subsidies in the infrastructure package. And what had just happened this week, which, you know, was very exciting, those of us that have been working on it, is when the transportation and infrastructure bill was first introduced on June 11th. It was transportation and traditional infrastructure for bridges and roads. On the 22nd of January, House leadership sort of fully expanded that bill so that it includes broadband, it includes schools. And that was, of course, the one that we have been very concerned about. And in it is $100 billion. The proposal is to authorize $100 billion in grants by formula to states, $20 billion a year over 5 years. And in particular, one of the things they did is they renamed it the Reopen and Rebuild America School Act, with the idea that in FY20, there could be a supplemental that would help school districts with the costs of reopening. And there's also then $30 billion for bond subsidies. But it's the first time that we have seen a bill of this scale and with this level of support. It will likely pass the House. What whether it passes the Senate will in part be up to all of us in our communities communicating with leadership about what our priorities are. So it's a big opportunity for school districts to really be able to fill the gaps between revenues lost as well as needs that need to be prioritized. So anyway, it's a big deal. It's good progress, but it is not, that deal is nowhere near sealed.
Do you think that's going to get, Mary, do you think that, just as follow-up, do you think that's going to get rolled into a broader stimulus package, or do you think that's going to stand on its own?
No, it's in a broad stimulus package. It did get rolled into the broad stimulus package. In some ways, the question is whether or not, and Seth might have a better read on that, is whether it'll get rolled out, whether sort of the reopening dollars might get pulled out, and everybody will argue about infrastructure for the next 6 to 9 months to a year. I think there's some good possibilities that might happen. I think that there's a much more of an appreciation across the country, and then it's found its way to Washington, that the task that school districts and schools have been asked to take on to reopen in a pandemic is really a big one, and it's critical to the economy reopening, but that they're not necessarily going to be able to do it without federal funds.
What are your thoughts on that, Seth? What about state and local government?
Wow. So first of all, I'm going to say I worked in government long enough. I'm not going to try to mind read what may or may not come out of legislation. And honestly, even when it gets written out there and you see it, Lord knows what happens between that and what passes at the end of the day. But, we hear as much about, rumors and different things that are being discussed as anybody when it comes, especially to the broad infrastructure bill. That's a big question mark of what's going to be in there. It seems to be very transportation heavy, at least early on. But, once again, things are going to change a ton by the time it has to pick up the needed support to ultimately get passed, and everybody kind of gets their piece at the end of the day. So I think it's going to take state and federal. I think it's going to take everybody trying to figure out the right solution for the different issues. The biggest gap I've seen right now is probably trying to cover like the operating issues. So, CARES Act has some money in there for governments to help pay for their costs for COVID, not necessarily costs to cover lost revenues, which, like I said, has really been the driver for the financial issues that states are seeing, different state agencies are seeing, plenty of local governments are seeing. So that's a big hole right now that, I don't know where that may get filled. If it does, it may be relying on the state level to try to help with that, whether we get something federal or not. And then you have the broader stimulus type funding that is really tends to fall under the idea of job retention and creation and, getting the economy going, that ultimately has a lot of opportunities for local governments and states if they can put themselves in position to utilize that funding when it becomes available. I know there's been talk of something maybe similar, and the broad infrastructure would probably fall into this. It's something like the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that we had in 2009. The one thing about those type programs is generally the federal government's looking to push money through the existing programs that are out there. And we're seeing that already. So things like the Economic Development Agency or Administration, EDA, the Community Development Block Grants, which is through HUD. A variety of different agencies are starting to get some money that has ties to COVID to provide grants for a variety of different things that kind of fall in their wheelhouse. There's still a lot of lack of clarity about how that's going to be administered, what actually qualifies for this funding. I've been on that side of an agency that got money for stuff that really wasn't what we did, and we're trying to figure out how you, create COVID water projects, for instance, to, help tie those together. And it's a creative exercise. So there's still a lot of uncertainty out there about how much, when, and what form additional funding is going to show up.
Steve, just to say, related to that, part of what we've been working on with the National Council on School Facilities and some of the other ed groups is one of the things that I think the schools and the districts need to do is actually get the number for what is it costing to reopen after COVID. And so that's something that I think is going to be important so that officials are making sort of data informed decision making. I mean, clearly there's a lot of desire to help schools reopen because people want them reopened. But it is important to identify, you know, how much of it is building related, how much of it is staffing related, how much of it is technology related. And we're you know, working on that now.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, to just try to quantify what you can while it's occurring, in the hopes and the thought you're going to have to try to support stuff later.
Do we know what that number looks like yet? Any idea?
Well, we've taken some rough looks at it, and we were from a facilities perspective and a, you know, kind of having a nurse in every school. They're only in about 80% of the schools have full or part-time nurses. So we were looking at nurses from a staffing perspective, custodial from a staffing perspective. We weren't looking at the instructional side. And then we were looking at cleaning and supplies and hand sanitation and masks. And we came up with at least about 400 a student, which if you multiply that times 50 million, that's $20 billion, you know, in terms of added costs. And that's not any capital costs. That's not temporary classrooms for social distancing. That's not replacing HVAC. So, you know, it's a big number. I mean,
big number.
It's a big number, yeah.
Seth, what about yourself? Have you guys looked at any of that as it applies to local government?
No, like I said, I think right now they're still trying to figure out what the gaps are. There's so much uncertainty about when some of those things come back. It's not I wish it was as easy in some ways as the calculation of reopening and, you know, some of those costs that are associated on our first unit and just supply type things. The problem here is still there's just so much that's unknown about what the impacts are going to be. We talk about first waves and second waves. I mean, we're really still just trying to figure out what's happened at the first of the first wave almost at this point.
Yeah, everything is still relatively new, and a lot of questions, and more questions than answers, certainly. One thing, so let's start talking a little bit about some of the things that can be done, actionable steps that everybody can look at and take today. One last question I wanted to ask before moving into that is that, do either of you have specific places that you can recommend for information for those that are listening today? Where information regarding some of the funding may be. I know states each have their own pages set up. Is there any little places that you guys go to look for this stuff, and as far as news and information?
So, I mean, of course, Ed Week has been fantastic on this, I have to say. So Education Week, they've really been working hard to get information as quickly as possible. On the National Council of School Facilities website, which is facilitiescouncil.org, we have a COVID page where we're looking at, tools for helping figure out a COVID capacity, tools for estimating the cost of operating and reopening under COVID. We're also right now in the process of analyzing each state's guidance. And so by going to the state page, it'll take you directly to the guidance. And what we found is you could go to a COVID page and you'd still have to dig and dig and dig to get to the guidance. So we've been doing that. We're in the process of really trying to compare. Is everybody, we want to know, is everybody telling you the same thing, or is there much variety state by state in terms of what's being told to districts on what they have to do, on who's decided, on kind of what they're prioritizing? So we're doing that. As part of that process, we're also looking at the CARES funding state by state and how they're doing that. But we're in the process, and we're probably about another 10 days out from completing the state by state analysis and states are still coming out, day by day with guidance and making changes on their initial guidance. So it's, I really feel for the districts. It's essentially a hodgepodge, state by state, and even within the states. Generally speaking, the states are passing the buck down to the local. So it's really a challenge. People, because of the uncertainty, people are reluctant to say, well, no, you can only have classes of 15, or no, they've got to be 10, or no, fine, bring them back at 20, but just stick them in masks. Nobody's really coming down and giving guidance to districts. And so the tendency is to go real conservative. And because, school districts take their in loco parentis very seriously. And so it's really a challenge.
What about you, Seth? Do you find any sources of information for local government?
Yeah, so, government doesn't work fast sometimes, and I think there's still a lot of catch-up being played right
Sometimes.
now. Yeah, so, at least what we see locally is, we have different things happening in different local levels, and the state makes a decision that kind of trumps some of those things, and there's a lot of back and forth as everybody's still trying to figure out what's going on. So, I think everything's going to vary probably a lot from state to state. I think the state will start centralizing more control. All the states will, to try to get things consistent as much as they can. So most of the states, if they don't already, are going to have some type of, Office of Recovery or something having to do with dealing with these issues, whether it's out of governor offices or other, DHHS, some other things. So that's going to be a good source to continue to see what is being done from a policy standpoint in the state level, and eventually what kind of funding resources are available at the state level. Right now, as far as kind of keeping up with kind of the daily chatter, the professional organizations that are out there do a great job. The more local, the better. I'll say once again, it's going to apply more locally. So, as an engineer, it's the AWWAs and the ASEs of the world. For local governments, in North Carolina, we have, city county manager groups. We've got, a variety of different entities out there. Something that is kind of widespread that tends to do a great job of some of these things is if you have an environmental finance center in your state, that can be a great resource as well. So North Carolina's got a great one, but there's a lot of other states that have those resources too, that can provide you not only updates on what kind of money's available, but just also just policy-wise, how to deal with a lot of the things that are being rolled out and how you're trying to respond to stuff. They've done a great job so far.
Great. So I get asked this question a lot by our clients at Do Solutions, but I'm going to pose this to you guys, and that is, what are the steps that we can take today? I mean, the federal government, as the money is passed down to the states, is not going to be a blank check, right? Nobody's just going to keep their hands open. There's obviously going to be some need that needs to be demonstrated to have access to these funds. What are some of the things that people can do today to get ready for that specifically? Seth, you want to start that?
Sure. So we touched on it already. So I think trying to quantify the impacts that you're seeing and expecting, doing it now is going to be a lot easier to try to quantify what those costs are than trying to put this back together a year or a year and a half from now of what actually happens. So if you can start doing that today, the sooner the better. That's always good in case you have an opportunity to receive some funding to offset some of those things, and we know it's out there. The other thing is when we talk about infrastructure programs, I heavily expect it to run similar to some of the things in the past. You'll hear things like shovel ready, because they want money to be spent very, very quickly, typically to help stimulate the economy, which doesn't necessarily fit large construction infrastructure projects very well. They're not necessarily fast moving projects, but, going ahead and identifying what are your priorities. What are your transportation priorities? What are your water sewer priorities? The different type programs that are available. Picking, the right project or two to make sure, even in a tight financial situation, to try to put some resources towards getting those things ready to go as soon as money comes available, because it's going to come quickly when it comes. It's going to have to be spent quickly. There's not going to be a lot of time to apply for some of these programs. I mean, it feels like monthly right now. We've got this program that pops up. Applications are going to be due in, 2 or 3 weeks, and they're going to have one round, and it's going to go, that type of thing. So going ahead and start thinking about the programs you use. Once again, it's going to come through a lot of the same programs for infrastructure. It's going to come through the USDA's, the state revolving fund programs, the community development block grant programs. So think about the types of projects that fit those programs, and know what you want to apply for before the idea of it coming available hits.
Great. How about you, Mary? What are those 1 to 3 things that we have to do now to prepare for this funding? What the districts need to be thinking about?
So they need to plan. And I think that being ready, as Seth is saying, is in large part being ready because you have a plan. You've got the data and information about your highest needs. You know what is going to solve your reopening problems. You know what's going to solve your basic health and safety problems. You know what's going to modernize and renew your infrastructure, both for health and safety, but also for education quality. Because if the Rebuild or Reopen and Rebuild School Act, which is a part of the infrastructure bill now, Seth, it did get added into that. It's not just transportation.
Right.
That money has a very broad permissible use because it's meant to modernize the infrastructure. But if you're not ready with your plans, it won't happen. And I think that certainly where that is designed to go is straight to the states by formula. And about 36 of our states, 38 closely maybe, have a state office at least. But we've got some states that don't have anything. And so that's going to be a challenge for them because they have to stand up a competitive grant program that addresses the facility needs of districts and communities. So the planning needs to be done early. And with our state directors, we've started working on it because quite honestly, that it's 20 billion a year. And if that first 20 billion doesn't, as Seth is saying, if it doesn't get out there, it doesn't get used, that next 20 billion, believe me, it goes way down the list. So part of what I would encourage folks to do is be ambitious. There's a 10% state match that's required on the grant program, but there's 10 years to match it. There's I think this provision got in there, but there's also the ability to get a waiver for the state match. So, there's some real, work to be done if, as Seth says, who knows kind of between now and then, but I think that the policy in the Rebuild America School Act is good. It's been worked on for a number of years. The bill in the Senate is identical to the bill in the House. And, we basically need the communities to not be as afraid of their infrastructure problems. And this is partly how the highways and bridges folks, they started to fess up, say, nope, we got these problems. We got bridges that are going to fall down. And school people, because their children in these places, tend to be a little embarrassed, like, no, it's okay. We've got it under control, even when it's not. And it's part because of the obligation to provide healthy and safe places for kids. So you don't like to say, well, it's not healthy or safe. So I get that, but it's really not the time to be shy about this or to be, that's the optimistic part of me, Seth, that, if people say, no, we can't modernize this infrastructure and we're going to start thinking about it now, which seems like, why would you think about it now? But I think you can, and I think we can push this through, but the planning has got to start now. And it's got to engage your communities. You've got to engage your other agencies. It's a real piece of work, but you can do it on Zoom.
Seth, any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's the other thing. I think that's a great point as far as assessing your issues. One of the issues we run into for a lot of the infrastructure, however, is we still have this huge gap, especially when it comes to like buried infrastructure, where people don't really know what they have still. They're really struggling to get a handle on stuff that was installed 90, 100 years ago. How much of it do they have? What kind of condition is it in? Where is it located? So, try not to stop those projects and processes. Keep doing the work to get a handle on your situation, even if it feels like it's a awfully big thing that's going to be hard to solve. I always say you can't manage what you don't know. So you're better to know, even if it's not good news, to try to figure out how to manage it than burying your head in the sand. And, keep doing that good work, because there's a lot of people out there doing great work trying to figure those things out. So keep doing it, even if it's not clear what the solutions are.
Yep. Well, this is a point where I'd like to, we don't have very many questions, but I've got to believe there are questions out there. So for those folks who can see the Q&A at the bottom, please feel free to ask some questions of the panelists. Don't be shy. There is no such thing as a bad question. I've got one here currently. I don't know, Teresa, are you able to see that?
Yeah, I can see that here. And yes, as Steve said, now we'll transition and we'll jump into our question and answer portion of this webinar. So please be sure to add additional questions as we get going. So the first question asks, is any of this funding available for nonprofit federally funded Head Start programs?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So the funding for the through education, the $13.5 billion on that is any program that's eligible under my daughter coming in here through. I think she must be on her meeting. She's not wanting to wake the baby. Sorry, folks. So anything that's eligible for federal funding in traditional, that would ordinarily get federal funding is eligible for federal funding. So as a federally funded Head Start program, even provided by a nonprofit, you would be eligible to receive CARES dollars. And what you need to do is work, contact the state education agency in your state to find out how they're distributing those dollars to nonprofit Head Start providers.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mary. Great. And I was going to say, we do have a couple more questions coming in. So, so thank you guys for submitting those. Seth, this question is for you. This question asks, is there a list of websites that you can offer for local governments to research funding opportunities and the categories that they may apply for and get ready for?
The answer is yes. I'd be glad to send that to you guys if you want to forward that along. But yeah, I'll be glad to put together some websites that people can use to follow along with the information that's out there and look at the programs that are available.
Great, thank you. Perfect. The next question, Seth or Mary, or perhaps both, when do you see criteria for this funding being released?
Well, the CARES funding already has the criteria out, and you can find that on, again, the State Department of Education websites, as well as the U.S. Department of Education website. But in terms of the stimulus, the criteria for its use is actually, you can see what's been proposed in the bill HR 2, not as originally introduced, but the June 22nd version, which, just to warn you, is 900 pages. But section K is the education funding section, and you can see sort of all of the permissible uses, and you'll see that it's very, very broad in terms of, capital renewals, buildings or grounds, new school construction, school replacement, It does not pay for operating. So it's not going to pay your utilities or custodians or routine maintenance and repair. Although I suspect with the reopen dollars that it also has in their language that says funding can be used for things needed to be done to facilitate the reopening. And so I suspect that some cleaning and decluttering and, getting windows that won't open to open, which would be like a, repair projects, that those might be eligible in the reopen part of that. That language is very, very general.
Yeah, I'll echo. So a lot of times what you're going to get out of legislation is some really general language with what seemed like some really good ideas to somebody when it was passed. That there's a lot of room for interpretation and policy that then agencies are trying to figure out what to actually do with it. So it's going to happen when each of the individual pieces of money come along, each of the individual legislations. And a lot of times those criteria will change and morph as it goes through the process as they try to figure things out. So EDA information is out there for some of the money they have already. CDBG is out for some of the COVID money they have already. But to give you an example of the lag, when I administered the ERA money to the SRF program back in 2009, the way it worked is we had a year to get all the money out, committed, and everything under construction, and we didn't get final guidance from EPA at the state until 3 months after the deadline for all the money to be spent. So, it's variable, and everyone be patient is what I would say. Everyone will try to figure it out as it comes along. Generally, the best answer is just work closely with the different agencies that have the money and are administering it. They're going to do their best, and they'll try to keep you up to date with the changes as they happen. But be patient and just try to communicate a lot is what I would say.
Fantastic. Thank you. The next question, Seth, I think this is for you. Are you aware if any of the funding will be available for libraries as well?
Once again, I don't know at this time. It's too open to know what potentially will kind of fall under that. Definitely, there are programs out there. Once again, it tends to come through existing programs. So, for instance, USDA is a good source of community facilities program. That covers basically any type of building that a local government has, so that could be libraries, that's public works, city halls, those type things. So if they're getting funding through this, then yes, there would likely be money available.
Great, thank you.
And on the infrastructure HR2, I think libraries might fall into another section, but they do not fall into the school section, although the school districts are encouraged to work with other agencies to do partnerships. And so certainly there would be some flexibility on that if a school and a library were, adjacent or combined for general public use as well as school use in a, what you might find in a community school.
Things like broadband money could certainly fit well with benefiting a library and some of those as community service to provide quality Wi-Fi for people that have issues, especially in rural areas. So, it may not be for like a new library, but certainly aspects to benefit a library.
Right. Yeah, and broadband is definitely a part of this infrastructure plan.
Fantastic. Steve, I think this question would actually be best suited for you. Will Dude Solutions be able to continue to keep schools up to date on stimulus funding? And maybe you can share some ways that the conversations and ways that you're currently helping our clients as well.
Yeah, one of the things that we're doing is we're working, as we mentioned before, that there's 50 different websites or web pages based upon each state as it relates specifically to the CARES Act. But really, each of those are just interpretations of the federal bill. So there's not a lot of room for interpretation on those, but we are going to do our best to keep our clients up to date on a state-by-state basis as news becomes available. We're doing that today and helping with some interpretation, I should say, of what that, of what things like systems are, you know, quote, systems and processes. You know, that's a wide, got a wide interpretation. So, you know, can software, for example, or can third-party services be included in that? And the answers to those questions are yes. And so we're going to keep them up to date, certainly.
Great, thank you. Another question is, if the district is looking to renovate spaces, will there be funding available for upgrading HVAC and infrastructure for these spaces?
If the infrastructure bill passes, absolutely, that's a core function for what it's supposed to be funding. You know, would be major building systems and components, the replacing them, and or if there's a major capital upgrade, not, you know, kind of replacing a fan or a motor, but a major aspect of the, you know, distribution system or boiler or something like that. So you know, absolutely. And in terms of the COVID reopening, to the extent that that is a separate sort of funding, as the issues and the research around air quality and is out there associated with COVID, I think it will also be covered. But as folks who've done major HVAC system replacements, these don't happen overnight. They need to be planned, they need to be engineered, they need to be bid, they need to, you know, there's a lot of work associated with that. So to the extent that you are thinking that to open schools safely, you need a major HVAC upgrade, y'all need to be ready to pull the triggers on that one, because that's a lot of work. That there's real lead time on that. So, you know, maybe have it ready to go, in which case you're in good position, and it might be that you even have it bid and you could probably pay for it out of this and do something else with other dollars. So, but I think, again, as Seth was saying about documenting, and even if you've got one that's going and you maybe have upgraded it a little bit, you maybe have done a change order that said, well, actually, we want to meet a higher, you know, fresh air standard with this system, or we're going to pay for some special, commissioning associated with COVID. You want to document that, and you want to know that you can cover those costs with COVID money.
Absolutely. Great, thank you. And we will, I was going to say the final question that we'll answer that we've received. Steve, can you speak to how people may use Asset Essentials to track their costs related to funding and projects for that?
Sure. We've only got 4 minutes left. So one of the things I want to do prior to answering that question, Teresa, is really thank Mary and Seth for taking time out of their busy days to join us today. Like I said, this is a topic that is getting a lot of questions from our clients and prospects that we talk to, and one that this is one that is passionate I'm passionate about from my perspective, and that is how do we modernize and update today's schools? Something that Mary and I have talked about. Seth, same thing applies to the infrastructure as it relates to local government as well. But again, I want to really thank both of you guys for taking time out of your day to join us. And I'm hoping that we're going to be able to do more of these. As this is a really dynamic time right now. There's more of these, as things change, hopefully we can, you asked what Dude Solutions will be doing in the future. Hopefully we can have a couple more of these webinars as that information becomes available. One of the things that we do at Dude Solutions that I think can be helpful. There was a lot of discussion today about how do we get shovel ready? How do we be prepared and have data ready and information ready to access the funding as it becomes available? One of the things that we help our clients with, and this is going to indirectly or directly answer your question, Teresa, about Asset Essentials, is that we're working today either through our own services or partner services to help help districts on running condition assessments. That can be self-assessments where they're not using third parties, but actually using the resources of the district to go and really do a thorough job in analyzing what the current condition is of buildings within the district and the facilities themselves. As Mary said, putting in new HVAC systems is a big task, and you need to be ready with that and understand where the reparations are going to take place and when. Other districts are getting into, I would say, more thorough facility condition assessments using third parties and engineering firms to assist with that. I think those are the types of things that we're seeing a lot of today, and where the dude can really, I think, help. The other thing we're doing is we're running various models that we have at our access on the facilities to help really pinpoint where investments should be made. And that ranks it by, risk or academic importance and other capacities too. But specifically to answer your question, Teresa, we have one partner in particular that we do hygiene audits and certifications with 4 facilities. The results of that actually, and the workflows associated with that actually make their way into Asset Essentials. So they become part of your day-to-day and preventative maintenance routines. So it really is sort of dovetailing into the custodial aspect of running a school on a day-to-day basis, but also preventive maintenance as it relates to not only current situations, but those that are COVID related.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, and as Steve said, thank you both, Seth and Mary, for being on this call today and really sharing this incredible information. I do want to just close with letting folks know that we do have information on our website, resources that we've been putting together, dudesolutions.com/COVID-19. And then, of course, you're welcome to reach out to us directly for, with any questions or needs that you may have. So thank you all again. We really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you so much, Seth and Mary. Take care, everyone.